Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to the third video for chapter 5. In this video we're going to take a look at adaptations for survival, in particular focusing on plants. Now for the sake of this video we're going to mainly focus on plants that live in the desert and how they adapt to desert living, okay, and some of the challenges that they face there. So let's jump into it. Okay, adaptations for survival for plants. Now here is a map showing the Australian vegetation, the different kind of ecosystems of Australian vegetation. You can sort of see the different colors there. Despite the fact that we commonly perceive, Australia to be very desert-like, there's actually quite a variety, ranging from your dry grassland and tussock grass kind of environments, which you can sort of see there in the yellow, your semi-arid, which is kind of your shrubland kind of environments all along there and there. And then you've also got what we have wet and dry low woodlands, yeah, which is indicated in this kind of color of blue there along the east coast and the west coast, a little bit down the bottom and up in the northern areas as well. And then finally we get a few patches of forests, rainforest, eucalypt forests, ranging from northern Queensland all the way down to New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania being the more temperate type of forest. So for plants, Australia's got quite a bit of variation, yeah. Now, how do plants survive in the desert? The challenges for plants in the desert often revolve around the fact that when they're in the desert, they experience a lot of water loss. There's not a lot of water available in the desert, so there's a low water uptake, high water loss, low water uptake, and also heat stress that the plant often experiences. And so plants have to sort of work their way around that. On the positive, plants living in the desert don't really have to worry about high amounts of sunlight. So photosynthesis is not a major issue in terms of the availability of sunlight. But for photosynthesis to occur, they need to have water and carbon dioxide that's there. So there's carbon dioxide, there's sunlight, but the water seems to be the key issue that a lot of plants struggle with, right? And so their adaptations need to revolve around that water and that heat that they experience while being in the desert. So plants need to maximize water uptake, minimize water loss, reduce the amount of heat that they're exposed to, and they also need to produce seeds that are drought resistant in order to pass on to the next generation. We're going to take a look at each one of these, starting with maximizing their water intake. Desert plants need to take up water through their roots, and where there is a low water uptake, they need to dig deeper into the soil in order to get to the roots. And so they have these water tapper roots, which are a special type of root rather than kind of just branching out normally like your regular roots do. These tapper roots extend very deep into the moist soil, and they don't start branching out until they start reaching water levels in the soil, and then they start to branch outwards. And these taproot roots can, be often about 30 meters deep, which can also be, in some cases, longer than the plant trunk itself. And they're also coated with a waterproof wax so that they can retain the water that they do manage to collect in the roots. So you can see there, really, really large taproot roots digging deep into the water. Whereas most, regular trees have to worry about branching outwards to stay stable. These ones kind of have to just keep digging as deep as they can. Minimizing water loss. Minimizing water loss is a very big factor in adaptations for plants. And so they have a variety of different structural adaptations that allows them to minimize the amount of water that they are losing, so that they can, whatever water they do collect, because there's not a whole lot of water there in the first place, whatever water they do collect, they can retain, right? Now, there is a bit of a trade-off. So when you minimize the amount of water loss, what that also means is you're slowing down the rate of transpiration in a plant. When you slow down the rate of transpiration, as we looked at in chapter 4, you also slow down the rate of photosynthesis. However, when plants live in the desert, that issue is not such a big issue because photosynthesis is always sort of readily available because of the high intensity sunlight that plants in the desert experience. And so all of these adaptations are really good at minimizing the water loss in the plant, but it also slows down the rate at which they photosynthesize, which also means that a lot of desert plants grow at a slower rate because they can't photosynthesize as fast as a plant, for example, living in the rainforest where water loss is not an issue. You just churn through so much water because water is readily available, and you speed up the rate of photosynthesis and the plant can grow. In the desert, you have this kind of slow and steady kind of race where they have to minimize water loss and so they slow down photosynthesis, and as a result of that, they grow a lot slower. Okay, we're going to go through each one. We're going to go through a few examples of how they adapt, and I'll explain some of those things there. Okay, starting with the cuticle. Now, the cuticle is the waxy layer that coats leaves. Whenever you feel a kind of green leaf, you'll notice that there's this kind of waxy, smooth texture of the leaf at the surface. That is because there is a wax layering it called the cuticle, and that cuticle prevents any water from being able to leave through the top of the leaf, and it redirects the water loss through only the structure down the bottom called the stomata. Yeah? And so most of the water is lost through the stomata. If the cuticle is not thick enough, then some of the water can go through the cuticle. So by having an extra thick, waxy cuticle, you can reduce the amount of water loss coming there. My apologies for the text that's been lost there through the image. Yeah. So the plants living in the desert will often have a thicker cuticle compared to plants living in grassland or in temperate environments there. Yeah. So if you take a look or compare these two diagrams, diagram A and diagram B, B with the thicker cuticle and also a few of the other stuff is more adapted to living in the desert. All right. The plant stomata. Now, I'm going to explain what the stomata does, and then we're going to take a look at a few different ways that the plant has structural adaptations to reduce the amount of water loss through the stomata. Because water can only leave through the stomata, reducing the number of stomata and the nature in which the stomata is exposed is extremely helpful for the plant, right? In the stomata, CO2 is able to enter into the plant, and then H2O and O2 leave the plant as part of the process of photosynthesis, and it sits right there. Yeah, the stomata is controlled by these two guard cells on either side of the stoma, which is the gap. Yeah, the guard cells will close or open depending on the amount of water that's already in the plant. If there is a lot of water, the guard cells naturally will open. If there's not enough water, the guard cells will naturally close. And so the plants can sort of regulate how much water is going in and out. They look like these coffee beans on the underside of your leaf that will open and close depending on the water content inside the leaf. Okay. For whenever the air surrounding the stomata is dry, what that does is it will stimulate water to move to the external environment faster. And part of that is, if wind is being blown across the leaf, it will dry it out, and then more water will actually leave the stomata. To prevent this, some plants will sink their stomata into a little groove within the leaf so that it provides a humid, sheltered environment. So here's a diagram showing one such leaf. You can see there, here is the epidermal layer of the leaf, right? Here is the stoma, right? However, you can see that there is, rather than just being exposed like it normally would, there's a gap and there's a sunken level of exposure within the leaf. And what that does is that sunken level creates a micro environment that is humid. And because it's humid, whenever wind blows across from the desert, for example, this part doesn't get carried away and it doesn't dry out, causing the plant to lose more water. And so it's a very smart way of reducing water loss in your plant. Right, here is another example. You can see there the cuticle sits right there, and then the stomata is sunken, and the stoma is sitting right in the groove there to prevent any more water loss. Okay. Sometimes the leaf will also be rolled up as well. So whenever they start drying out, they'll naturally start to roll up in order to prevent that. You can see that here's a cross section of another leaf that's been rolled up, and you can see all the stomata, which are already sunken, are facing inwards, so that the cuticle wraps around the outside of the leaf. And then all of the exposed air is sunken in here and reduces the amount of water that's escaping from this micro-humid environment. Okay, when the water is lost, it naturally curls, produces that humid environment, and the stomata are only found on the inside. The hair on the leaf also then kind of provide this humid environment. Now, once again, the trade-off, remember, is that the leaf can't photosynthesize as fast, and also in addition, when you roll it up, it reduces the amount of exposure to the sun and the leaf is not as effective. However, in the desert, that's okay. You can afford to not be as exposed to sunlight in order to save a bit of water. Okay. Some plants will use, rather than having full-blown leaves, they have leaves that are not really leaves, that are called phyllodes. These are more like leaf stalks. And what it does is, rather than acting like an actual leaf with stomata and everything. It's more like an extension of the stem, right? It kind of just sticks out, and it contains photosynthetic cells. It contains your cells that allows it to photosynthesize, but it doesn't have anywhere near the number of stomata so that the leaf doesn't lose as much water. It also reduces the amount of the effectiveness of photosynthesis, but it's a good trade-off to have. Okay, some plants decide to ditch leaves altogether, so they have no leaves. Succulents are a good example of this, where the succulents have these large vacuoles, which is really water storage cells inside of them, and they have reduced or basically no leaves, and so the stems can store the water for years because there's no leaf, there's no stomata, and the water loss rate is so low, and they have a very thick cuticle to prevent that water loss. So whatever water they accumulate, they store when they live in the desert, which is also another reason why succulents will grow very, very slowly, because they naturally will photosynthesize at a very slow rate because there's not that much water that's being used up in the process. And so succulent will stay small and stay in the kind of dry environment for ages without losing any water, and still quite that firm texture because they store the water and none of it leaves at all. Okay. Other adaptations in reducing heat exposure. So leaf color actually plays a really important role. Silver or glossy leaves often reflect more sunlight, therefore reducing the amount of heat stress that the plant experiences. So simply by having leaves that are of a slightly different or an off-shadish glossy color, you can reflect more light off the leaf, and the leaf don't get damaged by the intense sun and heat. Leaf shape, you will often notice that a lot of plants in the desert have smaller or narrow leaves, and what that does is these narrow leaves reduce the amount of surface area that the leaf has, right? So overall surface area by the leaf is a lot lower, and because it's a lower surface area, you therefore reduce the amount of heat stress that the leaves go through, and also reduce the amount of water loss as well. At the same time, reducing photosynthesis, but a small trade-off in the desert. And finally, leaf orientation. You might notice this actually when you take a look at eucalyptus leaves, and one of a very quite a spectacular phenomenon you'll notice about eucalyptus leaves compared to other leaves is that their leaves often hang vertically. Right? A lot of leaves kind of hang horizontally because what you want to do is with a horizontal leaf during the midday, the sun goes straight down on the plant, right? And so when the sun goes straight down on the plant and the plant has a horizontal leaf, then what that allows it to do is it collects all of the sunlight, right? It also means that the heat stress by the leaf is maximum or is maximized under those conditions. Eucalyptus leaves, however, hang vertically. So what that means is that during midday, the leaf is pretty useless because the sun pretty much shines straight through, but that also happens to be the most intense time of the day. So in the desert, you don't want to have your leaf fully exposed because they can get damaged and they get burnt. However, by having leaves that are vertical, it maximizes the morning sun and the evening sun, so the plant can still photosynthesize, but it doesn't. It remains cooler because it doesn't have that kind of heat exposure. Okay. And finally, drought-resistant seeds. In some parts of the desert, especially in the central parts where you're really talking about the kind of the outback, water is only available for a few weeks every couple of years, and so it is what we call ephemeral. Ephemeral meaning it comes along. It might rain bucket loads for about a 2 to 3 week cycle, and then you'll get nothing for years, for many years. And so that kind of ephemeral nature of the desert means that plants need to capitalize on the time frame that they actually have. So it doesn't matter whether you have really good techniques on leaf, reducing the heat exposure or reducing water loss. When it rains, you need to be able to reproduce as soon as you can in order to survive. And so the seeds or these ephemeral plants will germinate from seed. They will flower. They go through their entire life cycle within 2 to 3 weeks. And what that allows them to do is that they then release their seeds, and those seeds are extremely drought resistant, which means they last pretty much forever when there's no water. And then when the rain does come again, they begin to germinate once more. And so that is a really good strategy for plants to pass on their DNA to the next generation, despite living in these desert environments. So you might, go down to Central Australia and you'll see for most of the year grasses kind of look, grassy, and your kind of this off-green kind of color. And then for when it rains, all of a sudden they just flower immediately, and it looks this kind of spectacular look in the desert that you get, which you don't normally get throughout the other times of the year. Okay, so that's it for adaptations in the desert. Next time we're going to take a look at adaptations in the cold. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys next time. Okay.